Start. Here are the threats. Rook takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. b4 check. Rook to d1 check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes rook. King takes rook. King to e6. c7. King to d7. Promotes to queen check. King takes queen. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes queen. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is queen takes queen. Knight takes queen. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop. King takes knight. Another puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn. Rook takes knight check. Checks in this position are rook takes knight check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes knight check. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook check. King takes rook. g5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn check. Rook takes rook. The checks are queen takes pawn check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to h3. Rook to e7. Queen takes knight. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is g5. Pawn takes pawn. e5. g4. e6. Next puzzle. Here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn check. Rook takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop takes pawn. Queen to d4 check. King to h1. Next, threats in this position are queen takes knight check. Queen takes pawn check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes knight check. Queen takes pawn check. Rook takes pawn check. The best move in puzzle position is rook takes pawn check. Pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn check. King to h8. King to g2. Let's continue. Threats in this position are bishop takes bishop. Rook takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are rook to e1 check. Knight to f3 check. Knight to e2 check. The answer is rook to f8. Bishop takes bishop. Rook to e1 check. King to h2. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Next, the threats are bishop takes pawn check. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn check. Answer to this puzzle is rook takes pawn. Bishop takes rook. Bishop takes bishop check. King to g7. Bishop takes rook. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is knight takes knight. Rook takes knight. Pawn takes rook. Bishop takes pawn check. Bishop to d6. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to e6 check. The answer is queen takes knight. Rook to g2 check. King to f1. Next, here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Knight takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is knight takes rook. Rook takes knight. Rook to g8. Queen to f3. Rook takes knight. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn check. Checks in puzzle position are bishop takes pawn check. The answer is bishop takes pawn check. King takes bishop. Queen to h5 check. King to g8. Knight to g5. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Knight takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight to e7 check. Knight to f6 check. The answer is Knight takes bishop. Bishop takes rook. Knight takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Knight to g5, check. Next, the threats are rook takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are rook to d2, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. b6. Pawn takes pawn. a6. Pawn takes pawn. c6. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn, checkmate. Checks in puzzle position are knight to d7, check. Knight to e8, check. Knight to g8, check. Knight to h7, check. Knight to h5, check. Knight to e4, check. Knight takes pawn, checkmate. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes pawn, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are pawn takes bishop. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to h2, check. Rook to g1, check. Answer to this puzzle is pawn takes bishop. Rook to g1. Rook to a2. Rook to g3. Rook to a1, check. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes queen. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using pawn takes queen. Rook takes rook, check. King to g7. Next, here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. The checks are c4, check. The best move in puzzle position is h5. Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. King to e5. King to g4. c4. b4. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are queen takes rook. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to h1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. Queen to h1, check. King to d2. Queen takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is knight takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Bishop to d5. Rook takes bishop. Pawn takes rook. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are rook to h7, check. Queen to d4, check. Queen to h6, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to d4, check. Queen to f6. Rook to h7, check. King takes rook. Queen takes queen. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are bishop to b5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e7. Queen takes rook, check. One more. Threats in this position are queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to e1, check. Queen to d1, check. Queen to c1, check. Queen to b1, check. Answer to this puzzle is queen to c1, check. King to h2. Queen takes rook, check. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.